Philozoopia.
Today, we're embarking on, well, a really fascinating journey into the mind of Immanuel Kant. We're specifically diving into excerpts from a translation of his, let's face it, monumental work, Critique of Pure Reason.
It's a big one, definitely.
Yeah, exactly. Now, before you mentally check out thinking, oh no, heavy philosophy, just hear me out. This isn't just about, ancient, dusty ideas.
Not at all.
This deep dive is about something incredibly immediate and personal to all of us. How we as human beings actually make judgments. And maybe more surprisingly, how deeply our emotions are actually interwoven with that whole process.
Precisely. I mean, our mission today is really to explore this fundamental question that Kant grapples with, and it's one that resonates so profoundly even now in our modern life.
Okay, what's the core question then?
It's about the true relationship between, let's say, cold, hard reason, the logic, the facts, the objective analysis, and our often quite fiery emotions, our subjective experiences, our gut feelings, when it actually comes to forming judgments.
Right, because we tend to think of them as totally separate, don't we?
We absolutely do. Like, they're opposing forces. Reason is the cool, collected one, the decision maker, and emotion is just this wild card that messes things up.
Yeah, the irrational interference.
Exactly. But what if they're far more intertwined than we imagine? Especially in areas that really matter most to us, things like morality, our deepest convictions, maybe even what we believe to be true beyond what pure logic can actually prove.
Okay, let's unpack that, because that's a fascinating premise, especially coming from Kant, who, let's be honest, is often painted as the absolute epitome of pure, detached rationality.
Right, the stereotype doesn't quite capture it.
So we've been given this rich set of sources, mainly focusing on his critique of pure reason. We'll be navigating through his very intricate philosophical architecture.
It is intricate, definitely a structure.
Yeah, to uncover how he viewed the distinct roles of the understanding, of pure reason itself, and maybe surprisingly even of feeling in shaping our cognition, how we think, and our practical decisions, how we act.
And I think you might be genuinely surprised by how he positions our capacity for emotion, right alongside our loftiest rational pursuits.
It really challenges that common perception of him, doesn't it? That purely intellectual, almost austere philosopher figure.
It really does. It's a revelation, I think, that can change how you think about your own decision-making process. When you weigh logic versus that gut feeling.
Okay, so to begin this deep dive, we absolutely need to understand the philosophical landscape Kant lays out. I mean, where does he even start in the critique of pure reason?
Well, he famously saw this whole work as nothing less than a court of justice, for reason itself.
The court of justice.
Yeah.
For a reason.
Yeah, imagine that. Reason putting itself on trial. The goal is to establish its rightful claims, what it can legitimately do, and just as importantly, to dismiss its groundless pretensions, what it thinks it can do but actually can't.
Wow. Okay, so it's like an internal audit, reason examining itself.
Exactly. A rigorous self-examination of its own capabilities and limitations. It's ultimately about reason gaining, as he puts it, self-knowledge.
So this isn't a critique of, say, other philosophers' books primarily.
Well, it certainly engages with and refutes many existing ideas, absolutely. But its main target is the faculty of reason in general. Its grand overarching purpose is figuring out the possibility or impossibility of metaphysics in general.
Metaphysics,
Yeah.
the really big questions, right? Like reality, existence.
Exactly. The nature of reality, the soul, God, freedom. Can reason actually give us knowledge about those things? And the critique aims to meticulously map out reason's sources as well as its extent and boundaries.
Okay, so what can pure reason truly know, and where does it just hit a wall?
That's the core question. This immediately sets up this critical self-examination for reason, suggesting it absolutely needs boundaries, like a powerful ruler needing a constitution to limit their power.
It's a great analogy.
And it hints, right from the start, that some of reason's deepest strivings, our innate human desire to understand these ultimate questions, might actually be illusory. They might deceive us into thinking we can know more through pure intellect than we actually can.
So it's reason judging its own reach, its own capacity for true knowledge. What does it mean then when he says reason is afflicted with the restless striving for knowledge it might not be able to attain? That phrase itself, afflicted, sounds almost human, emotional even.
It absolutely does. It sounds like a kind of suffering, doesn't it? And I think that phrase highlights this core tension within human cognition. We have this insatiable desire, this deep need to understand the huge, profound questions, the soul, the universe's origin, God's existence.
You can't help but ask them.
Exactly, you can't help it. But our actual finite capacity to achieve that kind of knowledge through pure reason alone seems to hit a limit. It runs into contradictions or dead ends.
So this internal conflict, this striving versus limitation, is central.
It's a central theme throughout the entire critique. Kant saw that we, as humans, are kind of wired to ask these questions, but pure reason, operating on its own steam, just seems to falter when it tries to answer them definitively.
And this immediately sets the stage, then, for exploring where else we might find answers. Or maybe not answers, but a different kind of certainty.
Exactly, a different kind of certainty. And that's precisely where our emotions, our feelings, our moral sensibilities start to come into the picture in a really interesting way.
Okay, so within this grand critique, this self-examination of reason, Kant meticulously divides up the mind's faculties, right? The parts that deal with pure a priori cognition.
Yes, that's knowledge we possess before or independently of any specific experience. Knowledge that's supposed to be universal and necessary.
Like mathematical truths, maybe?
Exactly, or the basic principles of logic. And he outlines two main divisions for how we handle this a priori stuff: transcendental logic and transcendental aesthetic.
Transcendental sounds pretty grand.
It just means it relates to the conditions that make experience possible in the first place, rather than the content of experience itself. It's about the mind's own structure.
Okay, so logic and aesthetic, this is where we first see his foundational distinction between, what, pure thinking versus sensing.
Pretty much. Transcendental logic deals with pure thinking concepts, principles, understanding. Transcendental aesthetic deals with sensible experience, intuition, perception, how we actually receive data from the world.
So the mind isn't just a blank slate waiting for data.
Definitely not for Kant. It has these built-in structures, these frameworks that actively shape how we perceive and understand everything. It's like we come preloaded with an operating system.
Okay, this separation seems crucial. Can you break down transcendental logic a bit more?
Sure, it's the part that deals with the understanding, which Kant sees as the source of our a priori concepts. These are the fundamental categories our mind uses to organize experience. Think causality, substance unity, things like that.
The basic tools of thought.
The basic conceptual tools, exactly. And this logical part has two main subdivisions. First, there's the transcendental analytic. This is the constructive part.
Constructive how?
It focuses on how the understanding's a priori concepts actually produce knowledge when they are combined with the forms of intuition, basically, space and time, that structure our sensible experience.
Ah, so the analytic is where our abstract concepts meet the raw data coming in through our senses, structured by space and time, and together they construct what we understand as reality.
Precisely. It's how we build meaningful knowledge from the stream of sensations. It's like the mind's rules for processing incoming information.
Okay, and the analytic is divided further.
Yes, into the analytic of concepts and the analytic of principles. The analytic of concepts is about those basic, pure building blocks of thought, the categories themselves.
Like the individual Lego bricks of the mind.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, the fundamental mental tools we have. And then the analytic of principles concerns the rules that arise when those concepts, those bricks, are actually applied to how we experience the world through time.
So the instruction manual for putting the bricks together.
Exactly. How to build something meaningful and coherent, like the principle that every event must have a cause, which arises from applying the category of causality to our experience in time.
Okay, so that's the constructive side, the analytic, showing how we can form objective knowledge within the bounds of experience. But then you mentioned another side to transcendental logic.
Right, the transcendental dialectic. This part is primarily destructive, as Kant puts it.
Destructive. Sounds ominous.
Well, it investigates the faculty of reason itself, specifically as a source of illusory arguments and what he calls metaphysical pseudosciences.
Ah, so this is where reason gets into trouble. Tries to go too far.
Exactly. This is where reason, in its ambition to grasp the ultimate nature of things, tries to go beyond its legitimate bounds, beyond what experience can possibly confirm. And Kant argues this inevitably leads to unavoidable errors, contradictions, and illusions.
Okay, so that covers transcendental logic.
Yep.
The analytic for building knowledge within experience. The dialectic for showing the pitfalls beyond experience. What about the other big division, transcendental aesthetic?
Right. Now, aesthetic here isn't primarily about art or beauty in the way we usually use the word, although we'll definitely loop back to that later. And there's a surprising connection to feeling.
Okay, so not art criticism. What is it then?
For Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason, it's the science of all principles of a priori sensibility. It deals with the pure universal forms of our sensory experience itself,
The forms, meaning?
meaning space and time. Kant argues that space and time aren't things out there in the world that we discover. They are the fundamental ways our minds structure all incoming sensory data. They are the lenses through which we perceive everything.
So our mind doesn't just passively receive sensations, it actively structures them spatially and temporally before we're even conscious of them.
Precisely. Space is the form of our outer sense, how we perceive objects outside us, and time is the form of our inner sense, how we perceive our own thoughts and feelings, and also how we order outer experiences sequentially.
Wow, okay, so recapping this intricate architecture. The mind has transcendental logic, with the analytic, concepts plus principles for knowing, and the dialectic, reasons errors beyond knowing, and it has transcendental aesthetic, space plus time as forms of sensing.
That's the basic blueprint, and the crucial takeaway is that our knowledge of objects, our actual cognition of the world, absolutely requires both sides. It needs the understanding, providing the concepts from logic, and intuition, providing the sensible data structured by the aesthetic.
Neither can work alone to give us real knowledge of things.
Exactly. Concepts without intuitions are empty, Kant says, just abstract ideas with no connection to reality. Intuitions without concepts are blind, just a chaotic mess of sensations with no meaning or structure.
Okay, that makes sense. You need both the raw data and the framework to process it.
Precisely. And this initial clear separation between the faculties of thinking and sensing is absolutely key. It establishes these distinct domains before we can properly explore where they might meet or influence each other in the actual act of forming judgments.
Right, especially when we start thinking about judgments that aren't just purely logical or factual, but involve things like, well, feelings, values, moral convictions. Where do they fit into this structure?
That's the million-dollar question, and it leads us straight into Kant's analysis of judgment itself.
So Kant talks about different kinds of judgments. And this distinction seems absolutely fundamental, not just for his philosophy, but for understanding how our minds actually expand knowledge, how we learn new things beyond just defining terms.
Absolutely. He meticulously distinguishes between analytic and synthetic judgments. Getting this distinction clear is crucial.
Okay, let's break them down. Analytic first. You mentioned them briefly.
Right. Analytic judgments are those where the predicate, what you're saying about the subject is already covertly contained within the concept of the subject itself. The connection between them is thought purely through identity, through analyzing the subject concept.
So it's like unfolding what's already packed inside.
Exactly. Kant calls these judgments of clarification. Why? Because they do not add anything to the concept of the subject, but only break it up, make explicit what was implicit.
Can you give that classic example again?
Sure. All bodies are extended. To know this is true, you don't need to go out and measure bodies. The very concept of body for Kant and his contemporaries already includes the idea of extension or taking up space. You just analyze the concept.
Okay, so it's like defining a term or spelling out its essential features. It doesn't give you genuinely new information about the world. It doesn't amplify your knowledge.
Precisely. It clarifies but doesn't expand.
Yeah.
But then you have synthetic judgments. And this is where things get really interesting because this is where the real expansion, the amplification of knowledge happens.
Okay, so how are synthetic judgments different?
With synthetic judgments, the predicate lies entirely outside the concept of the subject. It's not contained within it, even implicitly, but it still stands in connection with it somehow.
So it adds something genuinely new.
Yes. These are judgments of amplification because they actually add to the concept of the subject a predicate that was not thought in it at all and could not have been extracted from it through any analysis. They synthesize or bring together two distinct concepts.
Okay, give me an example of a synthetic one.
A really important one for Kant is everything that happens has its cause. Now think about the concept, something that happens, an event, a change. You can analyze that concept and find ideas like occurring in time, having duration, maybe involving objects.
Right, things inherent to the idea of an event.
Exactly. But is the concept of cause contained within the concept of something that happens? Kant argues no. An event is just an occurrence. The idea that it must have a cause is a separate concept we connect to it.
I see. So we're adding the idea of cause to the idea of event. We're building a connection, not just analyzing event.
Precisely. And the profound question for Kant then becomes, how do we make this connection? How do we link these two concepts, something that happens and cause, in a way that seems necessary and universal? We feel like every event must have a cause, not just some of them. Where does that necessity come from if it's not in the concepts themselves?
And we can't empirically prove it for every single past and future event either.
Exactly. So this mysterious X, as Kant sometimes calls it, the thing that allows this synthesis, this connection, especially a priori meaning, without relying on specific individual experiences to justify its necessity, that's what Kant investigates so deeply. Synthetic judgments are where true learning happens. It's like building something new by connecting ideas that weren't inherently linked in their definitions.
And what's truly fascinating here, and this really leads us towards our core topic of reason and emotion and judgment, is Kant's particular emphasis on a specific type of synthetic judgment, the synthetic a priori judgment.
Yes. These are the real puzzle for him, the philosophical linchpin he needs to explain. They are judgments that are both ampliative. They add new information, expanding our knowledge beyond mere definitions, and necessary and universal. They are known independently of experience with absolute certainty.
Can you give another example besides causality?
Mathematical principles are his prime examples. Think 7 plus 5 equals 12. Is the concept 12 contained within the concept of 7 plus 5? Kant says no. You have to perform an operation. You have to synthesize the concepts through the act of counting or calculation, guided by intuition to arrive at 12. It adds information.
Okay, it's ampliative, but it's also necessary,
That's
right?
right.
It's not just true sometimes.
Exactly. It's universally and necessarily true. You don't need to go out and count apples every time to check if 7 plus 5 still equals 12. You just know it, a priori. The same goes for principles of geometry.
So these synthetic a priori judgments are crucial because they show we can expand our knowledge necessarily without just relying on observation.
Precisely. Kant states that the entire final aim of our speculative a priori cognition rests on such synthetic, i.e. ampliative principles. If we can make these kinds of judgments, if we can expand our knowledge with necessity before experience, then we need to understand how. What is this X that makes it possible?
And his answer isn't something out there in the world.
No, for Kant, that X isn't something we discover objectively. Instead, it's something fundamental to us. It's the very wiring of our own cognitive faculties.
Our mind's operating system again.
Exactly. Particularly the universal conditions of time in general, and the forms of intuition like space, which we discussed under Transcendental aesthetic. These a priori structures of our own minds precede and shape any experience we might have.
So our minds aren't just passive cameras recording reality. They're actively constructing reality, or at least our experience of it, through these built-in frameworks.
That's the core of his Copernican revolution in philosophy. And this foundational idea that our minds actively structure reality then opens up these profound questions about what role other subjective elements might play.
Like feelings.
Yeah.
Moral dispositions.
Exactly. If our minds are actively shaping how we understand the objective world through space, time, and categories, might our subjective experiences, our feelings, our deeply held values also contribute to how we form certain kinds of judgments, especially judgments that guide our actions, like moral decisions or judgments about things beyond experience, where pure logic, as we'll see, often falls short.
This feels like a critical transition point in his thought, moving from objective knowledge to something more subjective, perhaps.
It is. It's moving from the conditions of knowing objects to the conditions of, well, navigating life and making judgments about value and meaning. And it's where the heart of our discussion about reason and emotion really lies.
Okay, so this brings us to a crucial, almost, well, dramatic part of Kant's work, the Transcendental Dialectic. You mentioned this is the destructive part.
Right. This section explores what happens when reason, in its, let's say, noble quest for ultimate understanding, gets a bit too ambitious, when it ventures beyond the legitimate bounds of possible experience.
It goes off the map.
Exactly. He vividly describes this as reason embarking on a voyage into a shoreless ocean where it encounters nothing but troublesome and tedious efforts, leading only to frustration and illusion, not real knowledge.
So the dialectic investigates reason as a source of mistakes, Illusions.
Precisely. As a source of illusory arguments and metaphysical pseudosciences, reason, in this mode, mistakenly assumes it can grasp absolute totality on the side of the conditions when it comes to knowledge. It thinks it can reach the final, ultimate answers.
What kind of ultimate answers are we talking about?
Reason tries to understand the unconditioned. That is, something that is complete and ultimate in itself, without any further conditions or explanations needing to be given.
Like the very first cause of everything.
Exactly. Or the fundamental indivisible nature of the soul. Or whether the universe as a whole has a beginning or is infinite. These are the profound, foundational questions humans seem driven to ask.
But Kant argues we can't actually know the answers through reason alone.
Right. Because, he argues, no experience can ever give us the unconditioned. We only ever experience things that are conditioned, things that have causes, beginnings, parts, limits. So these attempts by pure reason to grasp the unconditioned, to go beyond any possible experience, inevitably become illusory. They generate ideas, but not knowledge.
He mentioned he uses a powerful metaphor for this.
He does. It's quite famous. He says the land of truth, the realm of legitimate human knowledge that the analytic explores, is like an island and enclosed in unalterable boundaries by nature itself. It's where we can operate safely and gain real knowledge.
Okay, an island of truth. What's beyond it?
Surrounding this island is a broad and stormy ocean, the true seat of illusion. This is the realm of metaphysics where pure reason tries to venture. And out on this ocean, Kant warns, many a fog bank and rapidly melting iceberg pretend to be new lands, deceiving the voyager looking around for new discoveries.
Wow. So reason gets lured by these illusions of knowledge out in the stormy sea of speculation.
Exactly. It's a striking image for the dangers of unchecked intellectual ambition. It suggests that reason, left entirely to its own devices in these purely speculative realms beyond experience, will inevitably get lost, entangled in contradictions, chasing after mirages of truth it can never actually reach.
That's such a vivid picture reason as this intrepid but ultimately lost voyager on a sea of illusion. And you said these illusory arguments manifest in specific forms.
Yes, he meticulously categorizes them. He identifies three main forms: the dialectical inferences of pure reason. Each represents a type of metaphysical pseudoscience born from reason misapplying its principles, stretching them beyond the realm of possible experience.
What are the three?
They are the paralogisms, the antinomies, and the ideal of pure reason.
Okay, let's take them one by one. Paralogisms first. What are they about?
The paralogisms are the errors of what Kant calls rational psychology. They involve making invalid arguments, jumping to unwarranted conclusions about the nature of the soul or the self.
How so?
Specifically, they invalidly argue from the simple, undeniable formal fact that I think, the unity of our consciousness, to the huge metaphysical conclusion that the soul or the I must therefore be a real and simple, hence indestructible substance, that persists unchanged throughout all our experiences.
So from the experience of having a unified consciousness, people try to prove the soul is an immortal substance.
Exactly. Kant critiques, for instance, the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn's attempt to prove the soul's persistence this way. Mendelssohn argued that a simple being, having no parts, couldn't cease to exist by breaking apart or disintegrating.
Seems logical on the surface. Simple things can't break down.
Right, but Kant points out a subtle flaw. Even if the soul is simple, it could still potentially vanish, not by disintegration, but by a gradual remission of all its powers. He uses the term elanguescence.
Linguescence, like fading away.
Exactly. Think of consciousness itself. It clearly has degrees, right? You can be more or less conscious. It can intensify or diminish. So Kant argues even a simple soul could, in principle, gradually fade out to nothingness without actually breaking into parts. Its intensity could reach zero.
So you can't definitively prove the soul's indestructibility just from the fact that it's simple or unified in thought.
Precisely. It's a very subtle but profound distinction. It shows the limits of what pure logical deduction from the I think can actually tell us about the metaphysical nature of our innermost self. We have the idea of a unified self, but not knowledge of it as an objective, indestructible substance beyond our experience.
Okay, so paralogisms deal with illusions about the soul.
Mm-hmm.
What about the next one? Antinomies.
The antinomies are conflicts of rational cosmology. They deal with reason's attempts to understand the universe as a whole. And this is perhaps the most startling illustration of reason's overreach when it leaves the island of experience.
Why start?
Because here, Kant shows that pure reason can seemingly prove both sides of a flat-out contradiction about the fundamental nature of the world. with equal logical force.
Wait, reason can prove contradictory things. How?
For instance, Kant lays out arguments purporting to prove, 1, that the world has a beginning in time and is limited in space, and 2, that the world has no beginning in time and is infinite in space. Or, another pair, 1, that every composite substance in the world consists of simple parts, and 2, that there are no simple parts anywhere, only ever more complex divisions.
So reason ends up arguing with itself and proving opposite conclusions?
Exactly. These are dynamic conflicts where both sides appear to be dogmatically asserting necessary truths, but they directly contradict each other. It leads to an intellectual stalemate, a complete impasse for speculative reason.
And the problem isn't faulty logic in the arguments themselves.
Not primarily, according to Kant. The problem lies in reason trying to apply concepts like beginning, limit, simple part, which makes sense within our experience, to the totality of the world, or to ultimate constituents of matter, things which lie beyond any possible experience. Reason is misapplying its tools outside their proper context.
Okay, that's mind-bending. What's the third type of illusion? The ideal.
The ideal of pure reason. This involves the errors of rational theology. Here, reason attempts to cognize a highest being, or being of all beings, what most people would call God, from mere concepts alone, without any input from experience.
Trying to prove God's existence through pure logic, like the ontological argument, maybe.
Exactly. Arguments like the ontological argument, which try to move from the mere concept or definition of a perfect being to the conclusion that such a being must necessarily exist, fall under this category. Reason tries to bootstrap existence from a concept.
And Kant thinks this doesn't work either.
He argues it's fundamentally flawed. You can't logically derive actual existence from a mere concept, however perfect or necessary that concept might seem. Existence, for Kant, is something that can only be known through experience or, as we'll see, postulated for practical reasons, not proven by theoretical reason alone.
Okay, so across paralogisms, antinomies, and the ideal, the message is consistent. Reason messes up when it goes beyond experience.
Yeah.
What's the key takeaway from this whole dialectic section, then?
The key takeaway is that these grand metaphysical ideas, the immortal soul, the ultimate nature of the cosmos, the existence of God, while deeply compelling and perhaps unavoidable for us to think about, are theoretically unjustified. We cannot achieve objective knowledge about them through pure speculative reason.
Why not, fundamentally?
Because the underlying principle reason uses to reach for them, the principle that the conditioned, what we experience, must ultimately rest on something unconditioned, an absolute ground, is itself not theoretically provable from experience. It's a demand of reason for completeness, but not something experience can ever deliver.
So pure reason, on its own, can only produce objective knowledge about things within the bounds of possible experience. Space, time, causality, those apply to phenomena.
Exactly. Outside of that realm, when it tries to grasp the unconditioned, it inevitably generates illusions, contradictions, what he calls transcendental shine, a kind of unavoidable mirage.
This critical limitation of pure speculative reason feels really important. Because if pure reason can't give us certainty about these profound metaphysical questions,
then what can? Or perhaps do we need a different kind of certainty?
right. And this limitation is precisely what opens the door, doesn't it? To the surprising entry of our subjective side, our feelings, our moral conviction.
It absolutely does. The failure of speculative reason to provide theoretical answers clears the ground for practical reason and the role of our subjective dispositions to step in and offer a different path to conviction.
So, if pure speculative reason hits this wall when it comes to the big ultimate questions about ourselves, our purpose, ultimate reality, where do we turn? If not to pure logic, then where?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting and maybe even a bit unexpected, especially given Kant's reputation. Because his own philosophical journey, if you look closely, particularly in his personal letters, shows he was thinking about the role of feeling much earlier than some might expect.
Really? Even before the critique was fully formed?
Yes. It paints a picture of a philosopher grappling with the full spectrum of human experience, not just the purely intellectual side.
Tell me more about that. That sounds fascinating.
There's a famous letter he wrote in 1772 to his friend and former student, Marcus Hertz. In it, Kant outlines the massive work he's planning, basically the blueprint for his critical philosophy. He mentions two main parts he envisions.
Okay, what were they?
A theoretical part dealing with phenomenology and metaphysics, what would eventually become the bulk of the critique of pure reason. But then he also outlines a practical part.
And what was supposed to be the practical part, this is the key, right?
Exactly. And here's the point that often surprises people. He explicitly says the practical part was intended to deal with, quote, one, the universal principles of feeling, taste, and sensuous desire, and two, the basic principles of morality.
Wow. Feeling, taste, desire, right alongside morality from the
Well,
start.
right there in the early plan. It highlights that these aspects, feeling, taste, and sensuous desire, were explicitly part of his thinking about practical judgment, about how we act and value things from the very beginning.
So it wasn't an afterthought, added later to account for things reason couldn't handle.
It seems not. It indicates a deep recognition very early on that our subjective experiences, our inner world of emotions, aesthetic responses, desires, play a crucial role beyond pure intellect, especially when it comes to the practical sphere, the sphere of action and morality.
That really humanizes him, doesn't it? It shows he wasn't trying to build a system based only on cold logic, ignoring the rest of what makes us human.
Absolutely. He even noted in that same letter that he felt he still lacked something essential for the theoretical part, which maybe hints at the profound shift he was undergoing, realizing the limits of pure theory and the importance of the practical, perhaps even the subjective.
That is a fantastic historical nugget. It definitely makes you rethink that stereotype of Kant. It makes his whole complex system feel more grounded, more relatable, knowing he recognized the importance of aesthetics and desire from the get-go.
It's like uncovering a hidden dimension of his thought. He saw their importance from the outset, even if his most famous work focuses heavily on the structure of theoretical reason.
And this connects to what you said earlier about the transcendental aesthetic, not being about art criticism and the critique of pure reason, but maybe connecting later.
Exactly, because when we look at his later work, especially the critique of judgment, the concept of taste aesthetic judgment becomes very important. And here we see a direct acknowledgement of the empirical, subjective nature of certain kinds of judgments.
How does that contrast with the judgments based on pure reason?
It stands in stark contrast to the universal, necessary laws of reason he sought in the critique of pure reason for objective knowledge. Kant noted that the term aesthetics was being used by some philosophers of his time, like Alexander Baumgarten, to designate the critique of taste.
And Baumgarten wanted to make taste scientific.
Yes, Baumgarten hoped to bring the critical estimation of the beautiful under principles of reason, essentially trying to find universal, rational rules for beauty to elevate aesthetics to a science.
Like finding a logical formula for why something is beautiful. So you could reason your way to appreciating art.
Kind of, yeah. But what did Kant ultimately say about that effort? Did he think it was possible to find rational, a priori rules for beauty?
Based on what you said, I'm guessing.
No, you just right. Kant firmly states that this effort is futile. Absolutely pointless, he thinks.
Why futile?
Because, as he argues, the putative rules or criteria for taste are merely empirical as far as their sources are concerned. They're based on observation, on experience, on how different people happen to react to different things. They can therefore never serve as a priori rules, as necessary and universal laws dictated by reason.
So you can't logically prove something is beautiful. You can't reason someone into finding a sunset breathtaking if they just don't feel it.
Precisely. You can't lay out a logical deduction that compels aesthetic appreciation. A judgment of taste, for Kant, is profoundly subjective. It's grounded in a particular kind of feeling, a disinterested pleasure, not in concepts or universal principles discoverable by pure reason.
So the feeling comes first.
In a way, yes. The judgment of taste itself, he claims, is the genuine touchstone of the correctness of any proposed rules for beauty, not the other way around. If some supposed rule of art dictates something should be beautiful, but people genuinely don't feel it is, then the rule is wrong, not the feeling.
Okay, that clearly separates the realm of subjective aesthetic experience based on feeling from the realm of objective knowledge based on reason and concepts. That makes sense.
It does. It shows a fundamental limitation of pure reason when it comes to matters of feeling and subjective response. Reason can analyze why we might feel something, perhaps, but it can't dictate the feeling itself, especially in aesthetics.
And this is where it connects directly, and maybe even more profoundly, to our focus on emotion and judgment when we talk about morality. Because it's one thing to say taste is subjective, but suggesting moral judgments aren't purely rational. That feels like a bigger claim, especially for Kant.
It is a huge claim and a crucial admission. It's almost revolutionary given his reputation for emphasizing pure duty and rationality in ethics. but he's quite explicit about it in certain passages.
What does he say?
He states quite unequivocally in the Critique of Pure Reason that moral concepts are not entirely pure concepts of reason because they are grounded on something empirical, pleasure or displeasure.
Wait, moral concepts. Grounded on pleasure or displeasure. That sounds almost hedonistic, not Kantian.
It sounds that way, but it's more nuanced. It means that while reason might provide the form of moral laws, think of the categorical imperative, the idea that a moral action's maxim must be universalizable, that's a formal principle derived from reason.
Okay, reason gives the structure, the universality test.
Right. But the content of these laws, or perhaps more accurately, their motivating power, what makes them actually binding on us as agents, what compels us to feel we ought to follow them even when it's difficult, that Kant suggests is connected to our capacity for feeling, specifically feelings of pleasure and displeasure, approval or disapproval.
So it's not just cold logic telling us do this. There's a feeling component that makes us care.
It seems so. It's not about seeking pleasure as the goal of morality that would be contrary to his emphasis on duty, but rather the very concept of moral obligation or the recognition of moral goodness might be inherently linked to a certain kind of feeling, perhaps a feeling of respect for the law, or a feeling of satisfaction in acting rightly, or dissatisfaction with wrongdoing.
This dramatically challenges that common perception of Kantian morality as purely duty-based, completely detached from any feeling or inclination. It suggests a much richer, more complex, more, well, human understanding of morality.
It really does. It avoids making morality seem like an alien imposition on our nature. It acknowledges that our emotional responses and subjective experiences are deeply intertwined with even our most rigorous moral judgments. They aren't simply external factors to be overcome or ignored.
But this introduces a fascinating tension, doesn't it? What does this imply about the nature of morality itself? Is it a kind of hybrid? How can moral laws be necessary and universal, applying to everyone, if they're partly based on something as seemingly variable and subjective as pleasure or displeasure or feeling?
That is the complexity Kant introduces. How can something be both universally binding, a demand of reason, and yet connected to subjective feeling? He grapples with this throughout his ethical works. It suggests that perhaps the universality comes from the form provided by reason, while the motivating force, the thing that makes the law meaningful to us as living, feeling beings, involves this connection to our capacity for pleasure and displeasure, or perhaps more specifically, the feeling of respect for the moral law itself.
It's a testament to his comprehensive approach, trying to integrate both the rational and the affective dimensions of human experience, even within morality.
Exactly. And this leads us directly into how reason operates in the practical sphere, where its relationship with our subjective states becomes even more central.
Okay, so while pure speculative reason might fail us in proving certain metaphysical truths, or even in establishing universal rules for beauty, reason takes on a different, but maybe even more powerful role in the practical sphere.
Absolutely. It shifts its focus. It moves from describing what is the factual reality that theoretical reason deals with to prescribing what ought to be the ethical realm, the realm of action and morality.
And this is where its interaction with our subjective states, our moral disposition, our feelings, becomes absolutely paramount.
Precisely. Theoretical cognition, as Kant defines it, is that through which I cognize what exists. It aims to understand the world as it is. Think science, observation, factual description.
Like the sky is blue or objects fall when dropped.
Exactly. But practical cognition is profoundly different. It is that through which I represent what ought to exist. It doesn't just describe, it prescribes. It tells us how we should act, what principles should guide our behavior.
So the practical use of reason is about figuring out a priori what ought to happen, generating moral imperatives.
Yes. It generates commands like you ought to keep your promises, or you ought not to lie, or more fundamentally, the categorical imperative itself. These are dictates of reason concerning action, not descriptions of empirical reality.
That's a really profound distinction. It's the difference between knowing facts about the world and knowing how we should act within it. The latter feels much more directly relevant to our lives, to our choices.
It is. And it's in this practical domain that reason finds a way to address those big questions that speculative reason couldn't answer, but in a very different way.
How so? If reason can't prove things like God's existence or the soul's immortality speculatively, through logic or observation, where do these beliefs come from for us? Especially if they seem so powerful and foundational to how many people live.
This is where Kant introduces the ingenious idea of the postulates of practical reason, and alongside this, the concept of moral certainty.
Postulates, like assumptions we have to make.
Exactly. Necessary assumptions. Here's how it works. Reason, in its practical use, demands an unconditioned basis or goal for moral laws to make complete sense. If moral laws, practical laws, are absolutely necessary, they command us without exception. And if these laws necessarily presuppose any existence as the condition of the possibility of their binding force, then this existence has to be postulated.
Okay, unpack that a bit. What existence needs to be postulated?
Primarily, Kant identifies three: freedom of the will, the immortality of the soul, and the existence of God. Let's take God as an example. For morality to be fully coherent and for the highest good, which Kant defines as the perfect harmony of virtue and happiness, to be possible, we need to assume a moral order in the universe, governed by a being who can ensure that virtue is ultimately aligned with happiness.
So we can't prove God exists theoretically.
No, but we must postulate God's existence rightfully, but of course only practically, for the moral enterprise to have ultimate meaning and hope. It's a necessary condition for the possibility of the highest good that morality commands us to strive for.
So these postulates aren't logical proofs of existence in the scientific sense.
Not at all. They are necessary assumptions that we, as rational moral agents, must make for morality itself to make sense, to retain its binding force on us, and to sustain our hope in a morally meaningful universe. Our practical reason demands them for its own coherence and purpose.
Okay, so we don't know God exists like we know 2 + 2 = 4, but we must assume it rationally as a basis for morality to function fully.
That's the idea. It's a faith grounded in reason's practical demands, not theoretical insight.
And this connects to the idea of the ideal you mentioned earlier, like the Stoic sage. How does that fit in?
Yes, that's another way reason guides us practically, even without providing theoretical knowledge. Kant says moral concepts can nevertheless serve quite well, if one attends merely to their form, as examples of pure concepts of reason, in prescribing the direction toward a certain unity of which the understanding has no concept. The ideal is key here.
How so?
He explains, virtue, and with it human wisdom in its entire purity, are ideas. They are abstract concepts, perfections we aim for. But the sage of the Stoics is an ideal, i.e., a human being who exists merely in thoughts, but who is fully congruent with the idea of wisdom.
So the ideal sage isn't a real person we can meet.
No, the perfectly wise and virtuous person is an idealization, existing only in thoughts. But this ideal, Kant says, serves as the original image for the thoroughgoing determination of the copy, and we have in us no other standard for our actions than the conduct of this divine human being with which we can compare ourselves, judging ourselves and thereby improving ourselves, even though we can never reach the standard.
So the ideal isn't real knowledge, but it's a regulative principle, a guiding star for how we should act.
Exactly. It's fueled by reason's practical interest in perfection. It gives us a benchmark, a direction for moral striving, even if we know we'll always fall short. It motivates self-improvement.
Can you give another example of how this works?
He uses the example of judging a malicious lie. Empirically, we can analyze its moving causes. Maybe someone had a bad upbringing, or they were under pressure, or they have a flawed temperament. That's the theoretical descriptive analysis.
Understanding why they lied.
Right. But beyond that, there's a different kind of judgment, a moral judgment. We still hold the person responsible. We impute the lie to their character. This points to the regulative principle of freedom and responsibility that practical reason uses. The ideal of truthful conduct serves as the standard against which we judge the action, regardless of the empirical causes.
So the ideal, like the perfectly virtuous person or the principle of truthfulness, serves as a practical standard, motivating our moral judgment and striving, even if it's unreachable in reality.
Precisely. It shows how ideas, generated by reason but not corresponding to any object we can know theoretically, can have profound practical power in guiding our conduct and shaping our moral framework. They pull us towards becoming better.
And this leads, then, to what sounds like a truly profound statement about belief, certainty, and where it actually comes from. It seems deeply connected to our subjective, emotional, and moral core.
It absolutely is. This is where the intersection of reason and feeling, or perhaps more accurately, moral disposition, becomes undeniable and central to Kant's practical philosophy. It's not about what can be known by pure logic or verified empirically, but what we can be certain of because of our deepest subjective moral commitments.
So what does he say about this certainty? Is it knowledge?
No, and he's very clear about that. He famously states, "No one will be able to boast that he knows that there is a God and a future life. For if he knows that, then he is precisely the man I have long sought."
He's saying if someone claims to have objective theoretical knowledge of God or an afterlife, They've achieved something impossible, something he himself couldn't find.
Exactly. He's dismissing claims of metaphysical knowledge in that domain. But then he offers an alternative. He says, the conviction is not logical, but moral certainty.
Moral certainty, not logical certainty.
And since it depends on subjective grounds of moral disposition, I must not even say it is morally certain that there is a God, etc., but rather I am morally certain, etc.
Whoa. So it's personal. I am morally certain, not it is morally certain.
That shift is incredibly significant. It highlights the subjective basis of this conviction. He continues, driving the point home. That is, the belief in a God and another world is so interwoven with my moral disposition that I am in as little danger of ever surrendering the former as I am worried that the latter, my moral disposition, can ever be torn away from me.
So the belief is tied directly to his fundamental moral character. It's part of who he is.
It's interwoven. It's part of the very fabric of his moral being. This is the crux of it. Some of our most deeply held beliefs, the ones essential for how we live and act meaningfully, are not products of detached reason or empirical proof alone. They are rooted in and sustained by our subjective moral disposition, our deepest values, our character, our lived commitment to morality.
This fundamentally challenges the idea that theoretical knowing is the only path to truth or reliable certainty, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It suggests that a deeply rooted moral conviction, perhaps felt as a profound inner sense of necessity or rightness, can yield a form of certainty for practical life that theoretical reason simply cannot provide. It's a certainty of the heart, you might say, but one demanded and structured by practical reason itself.
That's a powerful revelation. Our moral disposition, our deepest sense of what's right, becomes a source of conviction that rivals or even surpasses logical proofs for these ultimate questions that guide our lives.
Exactly. And this connection between what Kant calls interest and reason itself isn't seen as a weakness or a contamination of reason. It's presented as a fundamental aspect of how reason actually guides us, especially in the practical realm. Reason isn't just a cold, calculating machine.
What does he mean by reason's interest?
He explains that maxims of reason are taken not from the constitution of the object, but from the interest of reason in regard to a certain possible perfection of the cognition of this object. Reason itself has an interest, a drive, towards unity, coherence, completeness, and perfection, both in understanding the world, theoretical interest, and in guiding action, practical interest.
So subjective interest, in this sense, drives reason's pursuit of knowledge and moral perfection. It's not entirely dispassionate.
It seems not. It has its own internal goals. And this helps explain disagreements or different ways of thinking. Kant notes that if merely regulative principles are considered as constitutive as objective truths, then as objective principles they can be in conflict. But if one considers them merely as maxims, as guiding rules driven by interest, then it is not a true conflict, but it is merely a different interest of reason that causes a divorce between ways of thinking.
So different approaches might stem from different ways reason tries to satisfy its underlying interest in unity or completeness, not necessarily from one side being logically wrong.
That's the idea. He argues that reason has in fact only a single unified interest, and the conflict between its maxims is only a variation and a reciprocal limitation of the methods satisfying this interest. So even when pursuing knowledge theoretically, reason isn't entirely value neutral. It's driven by its own desire for systematic unity and perfection, for elegance and comprehensiveness.
So it's not just about collecting facts, but organizing them into a coherent, maybe even beautiful system. That drive for order and simplicity is reason's interest.
Exactly. And sometimes different intellectual interests or pragmatic approaches can lead to different ways of organizing information or different guiding assumptions, even if they're both functional or useful in their own way.
Can you give an example of these guiding assumptions driven by interest?
He refers to what were sometimes called principles of convenience, principia convenientiae. Examples he might consider include the assumption that all things in the universe take place in accordance with the order of nature, a necessary presupposition for scientific inquiry, driven by reason's interest in finding systematic explanations.
Okay, assuming nature is orderly, what else?
Or the principle that principles are not to be multiplied beyond what is absolutely necessary, commonly known as Occam's razor. This preference for simplicity isn't something we prove is true about the world, but it's a maxim reason adopts out of interest in elegance and efficiency.
Makes sense. Keep it simple, if possible.
Or even the principle of conservation, that nothing material at all comes into being or passes away. A guiding principle in physics, again, satisfying reason's interest in finding unchanging foundations. These aren't necessarily conditions we discover and experience, but assumptions we make for very subjective reasons, as Kant might put it, to guide inquiry, making our intellectual pursuit easy and practical.
So these are regulative principles, assumptions that streamline our thinking, driven by reason's own interest,
Yeah.
even if they aren't strictly derivable from pure logic or experience itself.
Precisely. They show that our cognitive efforts are also shaped by pragmatic considerations and a drive towards intellectual coherence and simplicity. You could almost call it an intellectual feeling of satisfaction when things are ordered simply and elegantly. It's another deep acknowledgement that our subjective needs, even the needs of our intellect for order and unity, play a role in shaping how we seek and organize knowledge.
Okay, bringing this all together then. If we connect this back to the bigger picture, Kant's deep dive into his own values put, critique reveals that human judgment is, well, far from being this monolithic, purely rational process we often assume it is.
Far from it. While reason certainly plays a crucial role setting boundaries for knowledge, providing the universal framework for understanding within experience via the analytic, it's also clear that it has limits.
Especially when it comes to those ultimate metaphysical questions or even aesthetics.
Exactly. And it's precisely through recognizing those limits that we see the importance of our moral disposition, our feelings, our inner world of values, desires, and that innate sense of right and wrong. It's through these subjective aspects, guided by practical reason, that we access a different kind of certainty.
A practical certainty.
Yes, a practical certainty, one that's absolutely essential for living a meaningful life and acting morally, one that addresses the profound questions that theoretical reason alone simply cannot touch. It's a profound recognition of the limits of pure theory and the vital positive role our subjective experience plays in how we find conviction and navigate our lives.
You know, what really stands out to me here, thinking about it, is how Kant, the philosopher we usually peg as the guy for pure reason and strict duty, actually opens the door so wide for this profound, deeply human interplay between our intellectual faculties and our subjective, emotional, and moral lives.
It's a much more integrated picture than the stereotype allows.
Yeah. The limits of theoretical reason, in his view, aren't just a failure or a dead end. There's almost like a hint, a directive from reason itself. As he puts it, it's about turning our self-knowledge away from fruitless and extravagant speculation toward fruitful practical uses.
Beautifully put. He's essentially telling us, stop banging your head against the wall trying to theoretically prove things that are beyond experience. Instead, focus your rational energy on what you can know and what you must postulate to live a coherent, morally grounded life.
It's a redirection of our intellectual energy towards what truly impacts our choices and our character.
Indeed. And that refusal of our reason, as he frames it, to give an answer to those curious questions which reach beyond this life, those big questions about God, freedom, immortality, it isn't presented as some kind of deficiency in reason. It's almost portrayed as reason's own subtle, wise guidance.
Guiding us towards what?
Towards what truly matters for human action and belief. Towards the practical sphere. It reminds us that some of the most important truths we hold, the beliefs that anchor our lives and genuinely compel our actions, aren't arrived at through detached, dispassionate logic alone.
They're interwoven.
Exactly. They're deeply interwoven with who we are as moral beings, shaped by our deepest commitments, our values, and that powerful subjective certainty that stems from our character and our practical reason working together.
Well, what a thought-provoking deep dive this has been. It really leaves us with this idea that maybe our feelings, our moral disposition, they aren't just messy, static interfering with clear, rational judgment.
Not at all. They seem to be integral, maybe even indispensable components.
Especially when it comes to those deepest questions of meaning and action, the questions that truly shape how we live our lives. So I guess the question for you, listening, is what does this all mean the next time you're facing a big decision?
Yeah, when you're weighing that cold, hard logic against a really strong gut feeling, or maybe an unwavering moral conviction that you just can't shake.
How much of your own certainty in those moments is truly logical, based on verifiable facts? And how much might be, as Kant suggests, this deeply personal moral certainty that stems from your unique disposition, your values, your character, a certainty that, for Kant, seems just as binding, maybe even more so for practical life than theoretical knowledge.
It raises a really important and I think still intensely relevant question for us today, doesn't it? In a world where we increasingly strive for, purely rational decisions, evidence-based reasoning, objective data ruling everything.
Which is valuable, of course.
Absolutely valuable. But how do we also acknowledge and maybe intelligently integrate these powerful subjective and moral certainties, these profound feelings of conviction that Kant highlights without just falling into wishful thinking or mere emotional persuasion or unfounded dogma?
That's the tightrope walk, isn't it? How to value both reason and these deep subjective convictions without letting one completely override the other inappropriately.
That is the ongoing challenge, I think, for human judgment. It's a challenge Kant grappled with in his incredibly systematic way. And it's one that, well, we continue to navigate in our own lives every single day, finding that balance between head and heart, logic, and conviction.
A profound challenge indeed. Thank you for unpacking that with us today.
My pleasure. It's always fascinating to revisit Kant.
Philozoopia.